Jumping! An ensign announced loudly, as the sun's view windows very briefly flickered into a dark black, only to go back to a full view of the ongoing battle basically instantly, having barely shifted the ship's position at incomprehensible speed. Shot cleared of Allied ships! Vice Admiral Kazadi tipped his finger on one of the armrests of the commander's seat that still felt anything but comfortable for him to sit in, as the tight grid of flashing lights reflected in his eyes within the twilight of the bridge. Fire! He then ordered. Not even a blink later, a burst of colourful light broke into his view from the side of his very own ship, lighting up the entirety of the bridge, even through the automatically tinting windows that absorbed a lot of the harmful light, so the crew wouldn't flashbang themselves with each shot. The relativity cannon fire tore through the enemy ship at an almost literal instant, with any travel time barely being conceivable to a mortal mind. In a large unload of energy that left almost the entire stern side of the Zodiator ship as a molten mass of dispersing slag, the main propulsion was taken out. Simultaneously, the two accompanying cruisers had also taken their shots, with the Civil taking out the engine of one more enemy vessel, while the Of the Roses had instead used its shot to disperse one of the enemy projectiles in order to buy their own hunter ships more freedom of movement. Those huge ones didn't go down easy from one of the Hunter's smaller shots, so using one of the larger cannons to dispatch it took some of the heat off them. Meanwhile, smaller targets on the enemy vessels, such as their own cannons, were gradually taken out by said hunters, whose own fire, while able to be quite destructive if intended no doubt, could be used in a far more precise manner. With more and more of their cannons failing, the protective volleys the core world terrorists could fire to hide themselves away also became less and less effective. Send the fallback beacon, Kazadi then ordered, since close-quarter attacks became less and less necessary. It seemed that the Zodiators had a hard time adjusting to the combat style of the human unkindnesses. However, that didn't mean they should take any unnecessary risks. Even if a pilot could have been able to avoid all enemy attacks in a perfect world, he knew that his pilots were only human. Casualties of their own had been comparatively minimal so far. However, as if to prove him right about his thoughts, he could see on his surveillance screen how just in that moment one of their ships was taken out by an enemy craft. He grimaced to himself and let out a mild sigh. One more family who would never see one of their own again. It took a moment before all the ships were reached by the beacon. Due to the nature of their own combat strategies, as well as the particular nature of hyperspace, it was entirely impossible to effectively contact any of their ships directly while they were out in the battle. Therefore, the order to fall back had to be broadcast as a general signal that each of the pilots could individually pick up as soon as they would keep still for long enough so that they could reach them. By now, the battle was already won. None of these Zodiatus' weapons were able to match the relativity cannons in effective range, and without the larger ships to back them up, their smaller hunters wouldn't be able to launch an offensive, shields or not. They could just stay back and fire until surrender now. As the signal was picked up, one of their ships after another disappeared in one last splash of hyperspace, as they joined back up with the larger vessels in an enclosing formation. Prepare for the retrieval of some of those projectiles, the Vice Admiral then ordered, as he hoped they would be able to track some of those spent shots their enemies had fired. They would have to figure out what kind of tech that was. In such a small-scale conflict, it was more than manageable to face it. However, it could offer some difficulties in larger fleets, especially since they didn't know how far this kind of tech could possibly be expanded and refined. It was quite possible this was just some form of prototype. While that order was followed, one of his lieutenants suddenly spoke up. "Sir, we have an incoming transmission from the planet. Civilian. Non-encrypted, but they seemingly had an access code," they related quickly. "Is the earlier interference cleared up?" he immediately asked back, to which the answer was positive. "Put it through, then," he immediately ordered, as soon as he heard that. He rubbed one of his tight braids between his fingers, as he waited for contact to be established. Once the line was clear, things remained quiet for a moment. "What are we best at?" he then asked the silent line, his chest tightening ever so slightly, even if he didn't have to wait long for a reply. "Topping from the bottom," a very familiar voice replied from the other end, sounding incredibly strained but most certainly alive. The code phrase was an old in-joke about something that had been said back during humanity's first contact with the Catastrophics, due to a slightly choppy translation. However, it more than sufficed here to tell Kazadi that the person on the other side of the line was not only genuine, but also not in any immediate distress. At least none that was brought onto her by someone else. "Good to hear your voice, ma'am," he greeted the Admiral, after taking a brief moment to allow his heart to settle. "The pleasure is all mine, Celestin," Admiral Krieger replied in between heavy breaths that sounded like a combination between being ready to collapse and absolutely willing to tear anyone's throat out at a moment's notice. "Excuse me for the unorthodox contact. My own means of communication have all been destroyed. Update me." A brief smile played on the Vice Admiral's lips. "No problem, ma'am. Things are under control up here, but multiple Allied Coivry ships were destroyed, and we suffered some casualties of our own, which I will take full responsibility for," he quickly complied. "By now, the enemy crafts have been largely disabled, and our fighters are falling back. What's the situation on your end?" There was a bit of a grunt from the other side of the line that seemed unrelated to the ongoing conversation. "I'm sure you did everything by the books," Krieger then replied a moment later. "Down here, the situation is precarious, but momentarily under control. We have an unconfirmed number of casualties after an attack with an unknown weapon. All squads are either KIA or unresponsive. We took down 6 enemy combatants, but can't confirm if there's more. I'm going to need cleanup, rescue teams, as well as pick up for me and 2 large off-roaders ASAP." Celestin nodded. "We're in a stable position, so we'll jump teams down right away. Hold out just a minute more," he assured her, while already signing in the necessary order to the troops they had on standby. "How bad are your injuries?" There was another groan of pain from Krieger's side. "Crushed cranberries," she replied, after a long moment that sounded like she needed to catch her breath. "Copy that," Kazadi replied with a grimace. "Sending Muti team with the evac." "Copy that," Krieger confirmed. "Krieger out." With that, the call was hung up. On his screen, Celestin could see how the preparations for dispatch of the requested teams was already well underway. Jumping towards the planet at FTL was generally discouraged by the galactic community. However, this was an emergency. They couldn't wait for normal re-entry. After watching the reported progress for just a moment, his eyes returned to the ongoing battle. He watched the enemy ships as they hovered dead in space, unable to maneuver. They seemed to have recalled their own fighters back in order to form some sort of protective wall around the motherships with their own small shields. Obviously it wouldn't be very effective, so it seemed like needless cruelty to make their own soldiers get in the way of the incoming fire. Something within Kazadi told the Vice Admiral they weren't going to stand down. "Sir, we're getting some strange hyperspace readings," his lieutenant suddenly announced, making him look up. "Weapon grade?" he immediately asked, knowing they had less than a moment to react if it was. However, he also figured there would have been more urgency to their voice had it been so. "No, sir, travel grade," the lieutenant quickly replied. "However, the readings are unusual. It seems like they are creating a stretch solely around themselves." Kazadi's lips shifted a bit as he took that in, and he briefly ran a hand over his mouth in thought. "Prepare to collapse," he ordered. "Maybe they will attempt some sort of running start. We can't let them get away." Right then, the light of what was happening had not yet caught up to the spatial distortion that their sensors were detecting, meaning the ship still looked perfectly normal, if damaged, when he looked at them. However, they were planning something, and that made them appear all the more ominous. His mind quickly went through their own protocols. The UHSDF employed hyperspace in nearly all its possible facets in their tactics. If it was even close to sensible, they would have something that was akin to the maneuver their foes were attempting to execute right now. A bubble of hyperspace solely around their ships? A dodge? Hardly. There was nothing to dodge like that. An attempt to hide away? No. They knew human ships could collapse hyperspace from the outside easily. Before him, the windows of the ship once again automatically dimmed, protecting the crew's eyes as the colourful light of the created hyperspace bubble finally reached them. "Hyperspace collapsed," the lieutenant then suddenly announced, causing Kazadi to blink in surprise as his eyes shot up to his screen. He hadn't given any order to collapse it yet, but indeed, it was gone. For a moment he thought that the stress had caused his officer to use the wrong term in haste. However, no. They had been completely right. It had not been dispersed in a controlled manner. It had collapsed. In a mild thud, the Vice Admiral's fist descended on the armrest, hand firmly clenched into a fist. "Those cowardly he began to growl, but then bit his tongue and released a low, almost grunting exhale, while his fist quivered from momentarily clenching tighter. "Prepare to search for survivors," he instead said, in a much more controlled manner a moment later. "Preserve lives." "Yes, sir," multiple of his officers echoed back, as he looked out of the window, where he could still see the ghostly afterimage of the hyperspace bubble link for a bit longer. It was always a strange feeling, seeing someone in the distance who was already dead. With her view darkened, and her goggles momentarily pulled off her eyes, she just stared at the glowing bubble of impossible colours. Her senses had already told her what was about to happen at any moment now, however her eyes still heavily constricted, as they finally witnessed what unfolded themselves. In what could be described as nothing else than a snap, the light of the hyperspace stretch instantly condensed down into its original size, as the universe all at once remembered that the laws of physics were a thing that existed, and brutally forced space to conform to them once again, no matter what may have been in between it and its original form. Anything within the strange round stretch was mercilessly ripped along with the convulsion, forcing all the injected warships and fighters into the single small point that the stretch had been generated from. Though not even a fraction of a second later, it all exploded outwards again, as the megatons of mass realized that they could not all exist in the same place at once, since the energy of the event was not quite potent enough to press it all into a neutron star or singularity. No longer recognizable blotches of undefined white-hot matter were instantly scattered in all directions like some sort of micro-supernova that accentuated the sometimes still burning nanostars that the earlier battle had created from the opposing fighters. It was almost pretty, but still, Sheila couldn't help but let her ears hang as she wondered how many of the enemy combatants had known about the decision to end things this way. Had any of them even been asked? Even if it was the far more disturbing answer in a way, she'd almost hoped that this had actually been one mutual suicide pact, instead of the decision of one single commander to choose death over dishonor. Especially while sitting in a ship that was technically under the command of someone else herself, that was certainly the less immediately petrifying option, even if it would probably spell far worse things in the long run. As she sat there, the shockwave of the collapsing hyperspace suddenly hit her, spreading out through space even without any medium to carry it, and rocking her ship gently while also penetrating all throughout her body. Of course, the earlier relativity fire had already caused similar ripples, and she was therefore quite used to the feeling. However, these ones sure felt a bit more severe than those of the UHSDF's own cannons. It was like she felt her own body distort, while also remaining perfectly in place. Almost like she was a stiff container full of water that someone had given a heavy smack from the side, riling up the liquid without it actually having any place to splash to. According to everything they knew, this phenomenon felt incredibly odd, but was entirely harmless to living beings, which was instinctively very hard to believe when one felt it on their own body. However, her dwelling thoughts were perhaps luckily interrupted, as she, or more precisely one of her scanners, picked up on a peculiar signature that one of the scattered debris pieces was sending out. Well, it was peculiar to her that there was a signal at all at first. However, then she quickly realized what it actually was. This particular signal was hammered into any pilot's head 6 ways to Sunday, and so she reacted relatively quickly when she glanced at the grid and realized that she was the closest ship to it. Firing up her engine, she turned her ship on the spot in a slight drift, before activating her generator and making a jump right behind the flying object. Once there, she allowed her computer to take aim for a second, before firing at a harpoon that quickly struck the flying debris, and lashed her ship onto it for a long cable, allowing her to pull the thing along with her after slowly using her backward thrusters to disperse its speed little by little. Pressing the indicator of her communication, she then spoke up. "Scratches to Sun," she announced. "I just recovered a black box. Permission to return for inspection?" The black boxes of modern ships truly were among the most ridiculous pieces of tech out there, in Sheeda's humble opinion. Built to withstand almost everything that would likely take a ship out for a combination of brilliant engineering and extremely flexible material that only worked in its intended manner on very small scales. Well, very small compared to the ships they were built into. The things were about half the size of Sheeda in the end. For many years, armies of scientists had attempted their very best to make this same sort of defense useful in ways that could maybe be used to protect actual people from catastrophic events, but to no avail so far. For now, the only thing those little marvels could allow to survive even something as ludicrous as hyperspace collapsing was information. Permission granted, Lieutenant Commander. The answer came back almost immediately. Return to hangar free. Copy, Sheeda replied. Scratches out. With that, she moved her ship around to prepare for her jump back to the sun. Hopefully this thing would give them some answers on what exactly this whole thing was meant to accomplish. Far away, in another part of the galaxy, a pair of mildly glowing red eyes was laser-focused on a large screen that was just one of many that had merged all over Nestantiot Station to broadcast the breaking news to anyone willing to lift their eyes at a slight angle to look at them. An attack on a core world, and not just any core world, Gerolitin itself. Something like this hadn't happened in, well, Curie didn't even know how long. Details seemed to still be incredibly fuzzy, as the battle so close to the Koivri homeworld had either just happened, or was still happening at the moment of the broadcast. However, what few details were known were already repeated on end in an endless scroll of text that was meant to catch as many people up to speed as was at all possible from the medium of television. Obviously, the same emerging details could already be looked up on the net as well, to find them in a more digestible format than the endlessly moving text next to the not exactly top quality footage of the occurring conflict. However, despite the speed with which it went by, Curie had no problem following the scroll as they stared at the screen intensely. Attack was unannounced. Multiple Gerolitin fleet ships destroyed. Official sources confirm humanity not the aggressor. Attacking ships presumed to be of Zoditus origin. Unknown weapon technology deployed during the attack. UHSTF ships engaged in combat after aggression. Miat delegation ship confirmed unharmed. Attack on government facility on planet simultaneous to spatial attack. Councilman candidate Orwin confirmed unharmed. Status of UHSTF General Krieger unknown. Status of Gerolitin Governor H. Sierrafy unknown. Status of Acting Councilman Afyana unknown. Allied core world defense fleets activated and inbound. General alert level raised to 8. Hyperspace travel shut down around the system.
Mother! Oh no!
Ween said with absolute shock in his eyes, both of his hands clasped over his mouth as his wide pupils quivered in fear from what they witnessed. Curie could understand his worry. Though Moore had supposedly been with James, so she would probably be fine. The cyborg was certainly more than just a little relieved that James was already confirmed to be safe. Though the idea that Admiral Krieger's situation was unknown was more than just a little disconcerting. Though despite the supposed lack of their commanding officer, it seemed like the humans had decisively won out in the battle outside of the core world's atmosphere, unknown technology or not. Given the subpar footage that some drone was likely recording from quite far away from the actual conflict, it was very hard to tell just what sort of weapon the unknown but presumed to be Zoditos attackers had unleashed there. It looked like some sort of emanating energy that destroyed what it came into contact with, but also interacted with it as if it had a physical presence. Curie had never seen anything remotely like it before, not even in their wildest theories, and their mind immediately wanted to go wild with speculations and ideas about how such a thing might work, now that they knew for a fact that it was possible from seeing it with their own eyes. However, the cyborg pulled themselves together and successfully forced the briefly almost overwhelming desire to focus on nothing else down, as they shifted their gaze slightly away from the screen to look over at their other currently nearby company. Then again, as much as they knew they couldn't let their guard down around him, Reprie's eyes were just as immovably attached to the last screen as Ween's were, as he witnessed the unfolding battle with quivering horror. His trunk was wiggling wildly in his face, and one of his hands nervously scratched over the plate of the table they were all sitting and standing at and on, right next to a piece of paper with a hastily drawn sketch of a spring-like mechanical leg that was inspired by what humans called running blades. The warrant officer's weapon also laid on the table, pushed a bit further away from his hand so he wouldn't be able to easily reach it. Though despite his focus, Curie couldn't quite help but speak up after a moment of watching him. "A core world attacking another core world," they said to the man, who they knew either had to know far more than they did about this, or would be far more invested in it unfolding. "This is unprecedented." Repriek seemed to notice that they were talking to him. However, he still remained silent and stared a good few moments longer, before finally pulling his gaze away from the screen. As his eyes met theirs, he looked a bit sick. It almost reminded the cyborg of one of the first interactions they had with the man, back when they nudged him slightly to hand his spy device back to him, after he tried to hide it in James's cabin. Though this time, the cyborg was quite sure that they were not the reason why the man seemed like most of his blood was currently rushing into his stomach. Could he actually be shocked about what was happening? Was this not part of the plan? "Unprecedented doesn't even come close to describing it," he mumbled, and couldn't hold the cyborg's gaze for long, looking down to the table's plate instead. "And these aren't just any core worlds. Osnajar and Gerolitin have been allied for an unimaginably long time. The thought that they would even think of attacking each other. What sort of madness could have caused something like this?" Curie was the first to admit to themselves that they were far from the best at reading people. If someone with even a modicum of skill in acting wanted to make them believe something untrue about the person they were talking to, they would never deny that there was a good chance of that person succeeding. Still, Repriek's reaction felt genuine to them, as if he had never actually expected something like this to happen. Not in a million years. Maybe it was just skillful acting, and Curie knew that they should have been suspicious like that. However, despite everything he had done, they couldn't quite bring themselves to suspect that he was lying at that moment. "I know it is unlikely you will give me an honest answer, but," Curie began to say. However, Repriek was more than able to anticipate what they were going to ask, and replied long before they were finished. "No, never," the Sipperslang said, shaking his head heavily, and standing his trunk up while making a denying gesture with his hand that was so brash that he actually knocked his crutch off the small outcrop in the table it had been laid down on. "This must be some absolutely deranged people, no two ways about it. To attack a core world." Curie noticed Repriek's gaze briefly twitching down, his eyes jumping onto the personal assistant strapped to his lower arm, as if he suddenly got the urge to use it for something. Curie suspected he likely wanted to call someone, question them to make extra sure that they had, in fact, nothing to do with this. Though the Sipperslang suppressed the urge and pulled his eyes away, bringing them back up to the screen. Just at that moment, the implosion of collapsing hyperspace suddenly lit up the footage moments before the glowing remnants of what once had been the Zedaitos ships were scattered across the star system. Mui mumbled something in his home's language, as his eyes remained affixed to the screen. Curie couldn't even begin to guess what he was saying. However, his voice sounded pleading. "Suicide instead of surrender?" Repriek meanwhile mouthed breathlessly, as his nervous tick of excessively licking his trunk began to show. Although he had often been otherwise employed in recent times, Curie could see it in the man's eyes that he was still, in a way, military at heart. He knew the general values and doctrines that were conveyed to the soldiers of the communal military, both inside and out. And the idea of someone choosing death like this, it seemed to rock him to his very core. Slowly, he turned his gaze over to Curie. His eyes were almost pleading with the cyborg, even if they seemed to already know that his next question would be asked in vain. "Could it maybe have been the humans and their—" he began, but this time it was Curie's turn to cut him off, after anticipating what was coming. "While humans very much employ the collapsing of hyperspace as a tactic in war, the process is not invisible, or even subtle. Had the human ships caused that collapse, it would have been noticeable," they explained succinctly. "It could have still been a mere unexpected failure of the hyperspace generation, of course. However, with the rarity of such events, the timing seems unlikely. They weren't even trying to generate a real stretch, Rapri concurred dejectedly, and left his head hanging, his trunk also sinking down limply. I can't even imagine. Well, I hope they will at least find peace now, away from the madness. Curie paused for a long moment, staring at the warrant officer some more. Admittedly, the cyborg was a bit confounded at something. They knew for a fact the man had put his own life on the line for his orders, with a very real chance that they would lead to his death, more than just once, and yet the idea of being ordered to die seemed to disturb him. They couldn't quite figure out the difference that led to the results and reaction being so incredibly different. However, it was still very clear that there was one. And it seemed to hit the man hard. Self-admittedly, Curie didn't exactly pity the man. They didn't quite have the capacity to. They knew about so many horrible things he had done that simply seeing him distressed was far from enough to stir such deep empathy for him within them. Yet still, they weren't entirely left cold by it either, and if it was only because he seemed to be affected by these events in the ways for a lack of a better term, normal person would be. He was shocked at the sudden, seemingly senseless violence, and concerned about the people involved. Granted, it was likely only because they were people he considered worth being concerned about, yet still, the reaction was so normal in a way they didn't quite expect from someone with such a capability for unceremonious acts of cruelty and violence. Even this person who had tried to kill them, or at least had been entirely comfortable with them getting killed, was capable of such a reaction. And Curie wasn't sure if that made things better or worse, if they were being honest. It felt better because there was the capability for empathy there. However, it felt worse because they felt how they had been and likely still were willingly denied said empathy. He could have cared, he just didn't want to. Curie shook their body heavily, causing mild sounds from the engines running their legs' movements from the sudden force, as they tried to shoo away emotions that they really didn't want to be feeling at that exact moment. The thing that mostly kept them from following up on some of their uncomfortably aggressive thoughts at that moment was the fact that Muin was still with them, the worry for his mother written across his features like a deep engraving in a metal plaque. He did not need anything like that around him right now, that much was clear. Slowly they moved over to him and reached up one of their long legs to run it along his arm, while he still covered parts of his large face with both hands. She will be all right, Curie then assured the dark-furred Raphaelite, switching from their usual voice box to their more melodic one to put on a gentle, calming tone. She is stronger than she seems. Inhaling deeply as his nostrils flared, Muin closed his dark eyes and swallowed heavily, taking his gaze off the large screen for the first time in many minutes, or slowly hanging his head down.
Yeah,
he said, seeming to force hopefulness into his tone.
Yes, she'll be fine. She made it this far. This won't get to her.
Curie nodded with their entire body, and continued to run the tip of their leg along his arm. She will be, they repeated, both to the man and themselves as their own eyes moved upwards, their gaze falling back on the battlefield riddled with burning remnants of matter. I'm sure of it. Never in his life had James felt so drunk and so sober at the same time. His mind was entirely clear, running a light year a minute as it desperately tried to simultaneously process all the admittedly little information that he had in his current situation, and to not absolutely freak out while doing so somehow, a task he was ludicrously failing at. And it did not help that his body could barely keep itself on his own 2 feet. He had avoided completely fainting by a hair earlier, after reminding himself that instead of being terrified for Sheeta's life, it would be much more fair towards her to simply focus on trusting in her skills to carry her through. However, there was barely a little patch on an enormous crack in his facade, as he couldn't help but go over and over and over the fact of how much worse the situation that she needed to jump into here had been for her, simply because it was his damn birthday and they wanted to indulge over it. He should have stopped that, but no. He just had to go and let himself be swayed so damn easily, as if he was still that little boy following Coco around, whenever she visited the compound to try and get some attention. Of course, a quiet voice in the back of his head tried to politely remind him that she'd had, in fact, not only taken part in the festivities as well, but also encouraged him to do so. However, it was easily overpowered by the screaming rest of his mind. He briefly glanced over at the only somewhat conscious commander. When she said that they should match each other's drinks, that should have been the moment he stopped. She was like half his weight. What the hell was he thinking? His mechanical hand shot up, heavily gripping a fistful of hair as he tried to force himself to focus. What's done is done. There's no changing it. He should focus on anything else right now. Though, as he painfully pulled on his hair like that, his eyes suddenly went wide as he noticed something. Or, more precisely, didn't notice something. When had the alarm stopped? Just now? Or had it been out and he just hadn't noticed? Letting go of his hair, he lifted his face and looked around. If the alarm was over, then that meant... The uncoordinated movement of soldiers reaching for their phones and radios with different speeds went through the room, and after brief confirmation, the uniformed forces began to move, having seemingly gotten new orders other than guarding the safe rooms. Apparently the threat was over. James quickly fumbled for his own phone, his barely coordinated hands struggling extremely with the simple task of trying to call one of his contacts, much to the frustration of his already cleared mind. His finger trembled as he swiped it across the screen, trying to get it to the right damn place to make a simple goddamn call. However, he froze in the motion at a quiet sound that was immediately followed by a sudden stir behind him, as multiple people seemed to move quickly. And after just a second, James was among them as well. Nearly tripping over his feet, he damn near threw himself onto the sickbed that didn't stand too far away from him, his phone momentarily forgotten and eyes wide open, as they stared over at an endlessly familiar dark face that somehow had life in it for the first time in what felt like an eternity at that moment. Slowly and twitchy, Nia's eyes fluttered open as she let out quiet groans while mildly staring in place, while her doctors and nurses hurried around her and quickly began to take her vitals. After flinching heavily as a flashlight was quite suddenly shone into her eyes to test her photopupillary reflex, she began to move even more. Meanwhile, James and Tuya were basically pressed shoulder to shoulder close to the foot of her bed, the only thing keeping them from dashing right up to her face being just enough awareness to not get in the doctor's way. Still, although her movements were very slow, stiff and groggy, Nia eventually lifted up her head, looking around with still somewhat hazy and half-closed eyes. But that didn't stop her from smiling when her gaze fell onto the two who so nervously stood at her bedside there. "Hey," she said, in a quiet, croaky but still very much cheerful voice, as her unkempt hair fell down both sides of her face. Though James didn't see much more than that, because just about at that moment, his vision was entirely taken away by welling up waters, sweeping him along.